The steel and glass towers of downtown Chicago reflected the afternoon sun as tech CEO Jonathan Hartley stood in his corner office on the 58th floor, reviewing quarterly reports that confirmed what he already knew. His cybersecurity company, SecureNet Technologies, was dominating the market, with revenues approaching $12 billion annually. At 41, Jonathan had built his empire through a combination of brilliant engineering, aggressive business tactics, and an unwavering focus on innovation that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in America. His success had afforded him everything money could buy: a lakefront mansion in Winnetka, a private jet, luxury cars, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream about. But perhaps his greatest achievement, in his mind, was his marriage to Victoria Hartley, a stunning former model who had captured his heart 5 years earlier at a charity gala in Manhattan. Victoria, at 36, possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that stopped conversations when she entered a room. Her platinum blonde hair, emerald green eyes, and flawless figure had graced magazine covers before their marriage, and she now served as the perfect accessory to Jonathan's corporate success. Together, they appeared in business journals and society pages as the epitome of American achievement. The brilliant tech mogul and his gorgeous wife living a fairy tale existence that seemed too perfect to be real. What Jonathan didn't realize was that his fairy tale was built on foundations far less solid than the steel frameworks of his downtown office building. Greta Muller had been cleaning the executive floors of SecureNet Technologies for 18 months, arriving each evening after the corporate staff departed to maintain the pristine condition of the offices where billion-dollar decisions were made daily. At 62, she moved through the gleaming corridors with the efficient invisibility that wealthy executives expected from their support staff. Her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed and professional. Born in East Berlin during the Cold War, Greta had immigrated to Chicago 35 years earlier with her late husband Klaus, bringing with her a PhD in psychology from Humboldt University and fluency in 4 languages. But like many immigrants, she'd discovered that foreign credentials meant little in America, and economic necessity had led her into cleaning work that paid the bills while she raised her children and cared for her ailing husband. Now widowed and living alone in a modest apartment near the North Side, Greta found solace in her evening routine of cleaning offices where she could work in peaceful solitude while observing the remnants of corporate drama that lingered in executive spaces. Her psychology background made her acutely observant of human behavior patterns, and her decades of life experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when successful people were living lies. Greta had been watching Jonathan Hartley's marriage with growing concern for several months, not out of idle curiosity, but because she'd developed genuine respect for the young CEO who consistently treated her with courtesy and consideration. Unlike most executives who barely acknowledged her existence, Jonathan always greeted her warmly, asked about her family, and showed the kind of basic human decency that was increasingly rare among the wealthy elite. But Victoria Hartley was an entirely different story. Greta's first indication that something was wrong had come 6 months earlier when she'd arrived for her evening shift to find Victoria in Jonathan's office, speaking in hushed tones on his private phone line while he was traveling in Japan. The conversation had been brief but intense, filled with the kind of urgent whispers that suggested secrecy and deception. More troubling had been Victoria's behavior when she'd noticed Greta's presence. Instead of the polite acknowledgement that most wives gave to their husband's staff, Victoria had reacted with suspicious hostility, demanding to know why Greta was there and whether she'd overheard anything. The defensive aggression had immediately triggered Greta's professional instincts, reminding her of the guilty patients she'd once treated who projected their own dishonesty onto others. Over the following months, Greta had observed a pattern of behavior that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Victoria's activities. Late-night visits to Jonathan's office when he was out of town, extended conversations with people whose names she didn't recognize, and, most tellingly, the gradual removal of personal items and important documents from Jonathan's private spaces. Last week, Greta had made a discovery that confirmed her worst suspicions about Victoria's intentions. While cleaning Jonathan's office bathroom, she'd found a small recording device hidden behind the mirror, sophisticated surveillance equipment that suggested Victoria was systematically gathering information about her husband's business activities, financial assets, and confidential communications. The revelation had shaken Greta to her core, not just because of its implications for Jonathan's privacy and security, but because it confirmed that Victoria was engaged in some form of elaborate deception that could destroy the decent man who employed her. Greta's psychology training told her that spouses who secretly recorded their partners were typically preparing for divorce proceedings, where they planned to use private information as leverage for financial gain. But the final piece of evidence had come just 2 days earlier, when Greta had arrived early for her shift to find Victoria in Jonathan's office with a man she didn't recognize. A well-dressed stranger who was photographing documents from Jonathan's private files while Victoria served as lookout. The scene had lasted only a few minutes before they'd noticed Greta's presence and hurriedly departed, but the implications were devastating. Victoria wasn't just planning to divorce Jonathan. She was actively stealing his business secrets and confidential information, possibly to sell to competitors, or use in legal proceedings that could cripple his company and destroy his reputation. Now, as Greta cleaned Jonathan's office on a quiet Thursday evening, she faced an agonizing moral dilemma. Her evidence of Victoria's betrayal was circumstantial but compelling, gathered through months of careful observation by someone trained to recognize patterns of deceptive behavior. But revealing her suspicions would mean exposing herself to potential retaliation, job loss, and the possibility that no one would believe the accusations of a cleaning lady against a wealthy socialite. More troubling was the question of whether Jonathan would even want to hear such devastating information about his wife. Greta had seen enough human psychology to know that people often preferred comfortable lies to painful truths, especially when those truths threatened to destroy everything they believed about their lives. As she polished the mahogany surface of Jonathan's desk, Greta noticed that he'd left behind several important documents that Victoria would likely target during her next clandestine visit. The quarterly financial reports, merger proposals, and client lists scattered across his workspace represented billions of dollars in proprietary information that could give competitors devastating advantages if it fell into the wrong hands. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Greta look up from her work to see Jonathan himself approaching his office, his tie loosened and his usually confident demeanor replaced by the exhaustion that came from 16-hour workdays. He'd been spending increasingly long hours at the office recently, partly due to business pressures, but also, Greta suspected, because his subconscious mind was beginning to recognize that his home life wasn't as perfect as it appeared. "Good evening, Greta," Jonathan said with a tired smile as he entered his office. "Working late again, I see. You know you don't have to stay past 8 o'clock. "Guten Abend, Herr Hartley," Greta replied automatically, then caught herself and switched to English. "Good evening, Mr. Hartley. I wanted to finish your office properly before the weekend." Jonathan paused, his attention caught by her German greeting. "I didn't know you spoke German, Greta." "That's impressive. It's such a complex language." "Ja, it is my native language," Greta said, then hesitated as she realized this conversation might provide the opening she'd been seeking. "Mr. Hartley, may I ask you something?" "Of course," Jonathan replied, settling into his chair and giving her his full attention with the courtesy that had earned her respect over the past 18 months. Greta felt her heart racing as she prepared to cross a line that could change both their lives forever. Her psychology training told her that Jonathan needed to know about Victoria's betrayal, but her immigrant's caution warned her about the dangers of challenging powerful people's personal beliefs. "Mr. Hartley," she said carefully, "have you noticed anything unusual about your office recently? Documents moved, items missing, signs that someone has been here when you were away?" Jonathan's expression shifted from polite interest to focused concern. "Why do you ask, Greta? Have you seen something?" Quote. The moment had arrived when Greta would either retreat into safe silence or risk everything to protect someone who had shown her genuine kindness. She thought about Victoria's secret recordings, the mysterious man photographing confidential documents, and the pattern of deception that was building towards some devastating climax. "Mr. Hartley," she said softly, switching to German because the gravity of what she needed to say required the precision of her native language. "Vertrauen Sie Ihrer Frau nicht. Sie betrug Sie aber nicht nur mit einem anderen Mann. Sie stiehlt ihre Geschäftsgeheimnisse." Jonathan stared at her in confusion, clearly not understanding the German words but recognizing the urgency in her tone. "Greta, I'm sorry, but I don't speak German. Could you translate what you just said?" Greta took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save Jonathan from disaster or cost her everything she'd built in America. I said don't trust your wife. She is betraying you, but not just with another man. She is stealing your business secrets. The silence that followed was so complete that Greta could hear the distant hum of traffic 58 floors below. Jonathan's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally settling into the careful neutrality of someone processing information that challenged everything he believed about his life. Greta, he said slowly, that's a very serious accusation. What makes you think Victoria is betraying me? Over the next hour, Greta systematically revealed everything she'd observed over the past 6 months. Victoria's secret phone calls, her suspicious behavior when discovered in Jonathan's office, the recording device hidden in his bathroom, and most damning, the stranger photographing confidential documents while Victoria served as lookout. I found this yesterday, Greta said, pulling the small recording device from her cleaning cart, where she'd kept it as evidence. It was hidden behind the mirror in your private bathroom. Very sophisticated equipment, not something someone buys at an electronics store. Jonathan examined the device with growing horror, his expertise in technology allowing him to recognize its capabilities immediately. This is military-grade surveillance equipment. It can record conversations from anywhere in the office and transmit them wirelessly to external devices. Your wife is not just planning to leave you, Mr. Hartley, Greta said gently, her psychology training helping her deliver devastating news with compassion. She is systematically gathering information to destroy you. The man I saw photographing your documents, he was very professional, very careful. This is organized business espionage. Jonathan slumped in his chair as the implications hit him like physical blows. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was engaged in a conspiracy to steal his company's most valuable secrets, possibly to sell to competitors, or use in divorce proceedings that could leave him financially ruined and professionally destroyed. How long have you known about this? Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been suspicious for 6 months, Greta replied honestly. But I was not certain until I saw the man with the camera 2 days ago. I am trained in psychology, Mr. Hartley. I recognize patterns of deceptive behavior. And your wife, she is very skilled at deception. Jonathan looked at the recording device again, understanding that his entire marriage had been built on lies so sophisticated that he'd never suspected their existence. Why are you telling me this, Greta? You could lose your job, face legal retaliation from Victoria. Why risk everything to warn me? Greta smiled sadly, remembering her own experiences with betrayal and loss during her years in East Berlin. Because you are a good man who treats people with kindness, regardless of their position. And because I know what it feels like to discover that someone you trusted has been lying to you. In Germany, we have a saying, Die Wahrheit macht frei, the truth sets you free. But sometimes the truth destroys everything, Jonathan said bitterly. Yes, Greta agreed. But lies destroy more because they destroy slowly, from the inside out. Your wife's betrayal will eventually be revealed, Mr. Hartley. The question is whether you discover it in time to protect yourself, or whether you allow her to complete whatever plan she is executing. Jonathan stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights that had once represented his conquered territory but now seemed alien and threatening. His perfect life was crumbling around him, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was seeing clearly. What do you think I should do, Greta? I think you should be very careful about what information you share with your wife, Greta replied. And I think you should consider hiring security professionals to investigate what she is really doing with the information she is gathering. Over the next 2 weeks, Jonathan hired a private investigation firm that confirmed Greta's suspicions in devastating detail. Victoria had been working with a corporate espionage team led by Marcus Webb, a former SecureNet employee who'd been fired 3 years earlier for attempting to steal client lists. The plan was elegantly ruthless. Victoria would gather comprehensive intelligence about Jonathan's business operations, financial assets, and personal vulnerabilities, then file for divorce using the stolen information to claim half his wealth while simultaneously selling his business secrets to competitors. The recordings from the bathroom device revealed that Victoria had been documenting his private conversations with clients, investors, and business partners for months, building a database of confidential information that could destroy SecureNet's competitive advantages and violate numerous confidentiality agreements. Most shocking was the discovery that Victoria had never loved him at all. The private investigators found evidence that her entire relationship with Jonathan had been planned from the beginning, orchestrated by Marcus Webb as a long-term strategy to gain access to SecureNet's proprietary technology and client base. Armed with overwhelming evidence of Victoria's betrayal, Jonathan confronted his wife in their lakefront mansion on a rainy Tuesday evening, with FBI agents positioned outside to arrest Marcus Webb's entire espionage network. "Victoria," Jonathan said calmly as she entered their living room, "we need to talk about your relationship with Marcus Webb and the information you've been stealing from my company." Victoria's perfect composure cracked instantly, her beautiful face revealing the calculating predator that had been hidden beneath years of loving performance. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jonathan. You're being paranoid. I have recordings, photographs, and documentation of your espionage activities," Jonathan continued, his voice steady despite the emotional devastation of confronting the woman he'd loved with evidence of her complete betrayal. "I know about the surveillance equipment, the stolen documents, and your plan to destroy my company." The facade collapsed completely as Victoria realized her scheme had been exposed. "You don't understand the business world, Jonathan. You're too trusting, too naive. Someone was going to take advantage of that eventually. It might as well be someone who spent 5 years pretending to love you." The cruelty of her words was designed to wound, but Jonathan felt oddly liberated by finally seeing Victoria's true nature. "The FBI is arresting Marcus Webb and his team as we speak. You have 2 choices: cooperate with the investigation or face federal charges for corporate espionage." Victoria chose cooperation, providing evidence that dismantled an entire network of corporate spies who had been targeting technology companies throughout Silicon Valley. Her testimony revealed that Jonathan was just one of several CEOs whose companies had been infiltrated through romantic manipulation and long-term deception. The divorce was swift and decisive, with Victoria receiving nothing due to her criminal activities and the prenuptial agreement that voided all financial claims in cases of fraud or espionage. More importantly, Jonathan's cooperation with federal investigators positioned him as a hero in the business community, someone who'd helped expose a sophisticated threat to American technological superiority. 1 year after Greta's German warning had changed his life forever, Jonathan stood in the employee break room of SecureNet Technologies, sharing coffee with the woman who had saved him from financial and professional ruin. Greta now worked as the company's Director of Security Awareness, using her psychology background to train employees in recognizing social engineering attacks and corporate espionage attempts. "You know," Jonathan said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you said that night about truth setting people free. I think you saved more than just my company. You saved my ability to trust again." Greta smiled, her gray hair now styled more fashionably, and her modest uniform replaced by professional business attire that reflected her elevated position within the company. "Mr. Hartley, sometimes we must lose everything false to find something true. Your wife's betrayal was painful, but it also revealed that you are stronger than you knew." "I still can't believe I missed all the signs," Jonathan said, shaking his head at his own blindness. "Love makes us vulnerable to deception," Greta replied gently. "But wisdom comes from learning to recognize the difference between genuine affection and skilled performance. Victoria was very good at what she did. Her betrayal was not your failure." Jonathan nodded, understanding that his healing process was still ongoing but grateful for the perspective that Greta's experience and training provided. "I have something to ask you, Greta. I've been thinking about starting a foundation to help other executives recognize and defend against corporate espionage. Would you consider heading that initiative?" Greta's eyes lit up with interest and purpose. "I would be honored to help protect other good people from the kind of deception you experienced. Sometimes the best defense against lies is teaching people to recognize truth." 6 months later, the Hartley Foundation for Corporate Security had become a leading resource for businesses seeking to protect themselves against sophisticated espionage attempts. Greta's combination of psychological expertise and real-world experience made her one of the most sought-after consultants in the field, helping dozens of companies identify potential threats before they could cause damage. Jonathan's personal life had also been transformed, though in ways he'd never expected. His newfound awareness of deception had paradoxically made him more open to genuine relationships, and he'd begun dating Sarah Chen, a fellow CEO whose own company had been targeted by the same espionage network that Victoria had worked for. On a quiet evening in his office, as Greta finished her security consultation with a visiting client, Jonathan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a few words spoken in German by someone he'd initially seen only as his cleaning lady. Greta, he said as she prepared to leave, I need to ask you something I've wondered about for months. What made you decide to warn me about Victoria? You barely knew me, and you risked everything to protect someone who was essentially just your employer. Greta paused in gathering her materials, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized all her responses. Mr. Hartley, in East Berlin, I learned that silence in the face of wrongdoing makes you complicit in that wrongdoing. Your wife was planning to destroy a good man who treated others with kindness. I could not stand by and watch that happen. But you could have just quit, found another job, avoided the whole situation. Yes, Greta agreed. But then who would have warned you? Sometimes we are placed in positions to help others not by accident, but by necessity. I was the only person who could see what Victoria was doing, and had the knowledge to understand its implications. Jonathan nodded, understanding that Greta's intervention hadn't been just about protecting him personally, but about preventing a larger injustice that would have affected his employees, his clients, and the broader business community. I've learned something important from this experience, Jonathan said. The people we overlook, the ones we barely notice in our daily lives, sometimes possess the most crucial information about what's really happening around us. Victoria succeeded for so long because she knew I barely paid attention to the cleaning staff, the security guards, the maintenance workers who saw everything but weren't expected to matter. And now, Greta asked with a knowing smile, now I understand that wisdom and insight can come from anywhere, and that the most important voices are often the quietest ones, Jonathan replied. Your warning didn't just expose Victoria's betrayal. It taught me to see people differently, to recognize that everyone in my orbit might have valuable perspectives that I was missing through my own arrogance and assumptions. 3 years after that life-changing conversation in German, Jonathan Hartley stood before a packed auditorium at the International Conference on Corporate Security, delivering a keynote address about the importance of listening to unlikely sources of wisdom and information. Ladies and gentlemen, he told the audience of business leaders and security professionals, I want to share with you the story of how 3 words spoken in German by my cleaning lady saved my company from destruction and taught me the most important lesson of my career. In the audience, Greta listened with pride as Jonathan recounted their story, explaining how her warning about Victoria's betrayal had prevented a sophisticated espionage operation and led to the dismantling of an entire network of corporate spies. The person who saved my billion-dollar company, Jonathan continued, was someone I'd barely noticed for 18 months, someone whose PhD in psychology and expertise in human behavior I'd never bothered to discover because I was too blinded by her job title to see her qualifications. Quote, he gestured toward Greta, who stood to acknowledge the applause of hundreds of executives who now understood that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. Today, Dr. Greta Muller is one of the most respected corporate security consultants in America, but more importantly, she's taught an entire industry that the people we overlook might be the ones best positioned to protect us from threats we can't see ourselves. The standing ovation that followed was not just for Greta's individual courage, but for the broader lesson she represented, that intelligence, loyalty, and critical insight cannot be measured by job titles or social status, but only by the content of someone's character and the quality of their observations. After the conference, as Jonathan and Greta walked through downtown Chicago where SecureNet Technologies continued to thrive under new security protocols that she'd helped develop, they reflected on how profoundly both their lives had been changed by a moment of moral courage. You know what I think about sometimes? Jonathan said as they paused outside the building where their relationship had begun. What would have happened if you hadn't warned me that night? Where would I be now if Victoria's plan had succeeded? Greta considered the question seriously. I think you would have survived, Mr. Hartley. Good people have a way of finding their strength when everything false is stripped away, but it would have been much more painful, and many other people would have been hurt in the process. Including you, Jonathan pointed out. If SecureNet had been destroyed, you would have lost your job too. Yes, but I would have kept my integrity, Greta replied with quiet dignity. Sometimes that is more valuable than job security. As they parted ways that evening, Jonathan understood that his encounter with Greta had taught him something more profound than just the importance of corporate security or the dangers of trusting the wrong people. She had shown him that courage comes in many forms, that wisdom often speaks with quiet voices, and that the most important conversations sometimes happen in languages we don't expect. The cleaning lady who spoke German had indeed changed his life forever, not just by exposing his wife's betrayal, but by demonstrating that real protection comes from people who choose to speak truth, regardless of the personal cost. Her warning had saved his company, but more importantly, it had saved his ability to trust again by teaching him to recognize the difference between performance and authenticity. Vertrauen Sie Ihre Frau nicht, Don't Trust Your Wife, had been the beginning of Jonathan's education and discernment, delivered by someone whose own trustworthiness was proven not through words but through the courage to risk everything for the sake of justice. In the end, the German words had unlocked more than just the truth about Victoria's deception. They had revealed the reality that the most valuable allies are often those who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing up for what's right, and that sometimes the person cleaning your office is actually cleaning up your life in ways you never saw coming. 5 years later, Jonathan stood at his office window watching Greta leave the building after another successful security consultation. She now drove a BMW instead of taking the bus, lived in a beautiful townhouse instead of a cramped apartment, and had become one of the most respected voices in corporate security. But what mattered most to Jonathan wasn't Greta's professional success. It was the lesson she'd taught him about recognizing worth in unexpected places. The cleaning lady who had spoken German in a moment of moral courage had saved more than his company. She'd saved his ability to see people clearly. Victoria was serving a federal sentence for corporate espionage, her beauty and charm useless against the evidence Greta had helped uncover. Marcus Webb's entire network had been dismantled, protecting countless other companies from similar attacks. Jonathan's new wife Sarah often joked that she had Greta to thank for their relationship, since Jonathan's hard-learned ability to distinguish between genuine character and skilled performance had made him capable of recognizing authentic love when he found it. As Greta's car disappeared into Chicago traffic, Jonathan smiled and returned to his desk, where a framed photo showed him and Greta at the FBI ceremony honoring civilians who had helped prevent corporate espionage. Next to it sat a small plaque with German words, Die Wahrheit macht frei, the truth sets you free. 3 words spoken in German by a woman the world had taught him to overlook had changed everything. Sometimes the most important warnings come from the quietest voices, and sometimes the person cleaning your office is actually saving your life. The cleaning lady had spoken German, the CEO's life had changed forever, and both had discovered that courage and wisdom recognize no boundaries of language, position, or social status. The truth had indeed set them both free,